Today, we're going to be talking about the connection between joint hypermobility and anxiety, and how joint hypermobility may be the silent root of anxiety that you might be missing. The first link between anxiety and joint hypermobility was published in 1998 by Dr. Rocio Martini Santos and her colleagues. And Dr. Martin Santos and her colleagues found that patients with anxiety were 16 more times likely to have joint laxity than those without anxiety. Multiple studies since that time have verified this connection between anxiety and joint hypermobility. One possible link between joint hypermobility and anxiety is an imbalance in the autonomic nervous system, which is commonly seen in people with joint hypermobility. The autonomic nervous system has two parts: the sympathetic, which regulates the fight or flight reactions, and the parasympathetic, which regulates those rest and digest functions of the autonomic nervous system. And normally, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are more or less in balance. As we go through the day, one part may be a little bit more dominant over the other part, but more or less, it's like a seesaw. And sympathetic and parasympathetic are more or less in balance. However, many people with joint hypermobility live in a state of sympathetic overload. This leads their brains to perceive that they are under threat. And there are a lot of reasons why this might be. Many people with joint hypermobility have chronic pain, and that sends a message to the brain that one is under threat. And even if it's just a state of chronic sympathetic overload, then the brain starts to feel like maybe the body is under threat. And hence, this leads to anxiety. And people say they have anxiety even though they rationally know there's nothing to be anxious about. A recent study by Christina Camparelli and Jessica S. Eccles and their colleagues was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, and they found that people with hypermobility and generalized anxiety disorder have changes in the way their brains interpret emotional facial expressions. Doctors Camparelli and Eccles and their colleagues looked at 63 people. Half of them had generalized anxiety disorders, and they did something called functional MRI studies to look at the way the brains process emotions. They asked the participants to process emotional facial expressions to see how certain brain regions contribute to anxiety in people who are experiencing anxiety. And what they found was very interesting. Hypermobile people had increased activity in a region of the brain called the amygdala, and specifically the left side of the amygdala, which processes threats. And then there's another region of the brain called the mid-insula, which processes and interprets internal bodily signals. These investigators also found a link between hypermobility and increased activity in the anterior insula, which is a region of the brain that's very important for processing one's emotional and physiological state. Another connection that they made was that hypermobile people had a stronger connection between the amygdala and the precuneus. Now, that's a region that's involved in attention and self-awareness. So the conclusion from these studies was that there's a predisposition to anxiety in people with joint hypermobility that reflects dynamic interactions between the areas of the brain that process threats and those that represent our perception of our bodily state, or how are we? And this observation suggests that interventions regulating the activity of the amygdala and enhancing the accuracy of our bodily interpretations may be particularly helpful for people with anxiety and hypermobility. The research is very important because it raises awareness of the connection between hypermobility and anxiety, and it identifies the need for targeted interventions for people who live with both hypermobility hypermobility and anxiety. So this is very important research and important to know for people who live with anxiety in the setting of joint hypermobility. The paper was published by Camparelli, C.N., and her colleagues. It's called Neural Processes Linking Joint Hypermobility and Anxiety, Key Roles for the Amygdala and Insular Cortex, and it was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in early 2025. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me today, and I wish you the very best on your journey.